At 11:30, a mass for the Catholic soldiers was held in the church of Rocourt. Because we of the general staff were in want of wine, Major Schmidt told me to try and sneak out with Löffelhardt and find some. So I started a little investigation among the inhabitants of the village, who advised me to apply at a villa situated at the northern limit of Rocourt. This villa was occupied by an old lady who lived there alone with her son, and who was likely to have a lot of wine in her cellar. When non-commissioned officer Comfey, Löffelhardt and I presented ourselves at the villa, we were thrown out by a young lieutenant who had already taken up his quarters there. So we returned to Major Schmidt to tell him of the failure of our mission. Kedor, who was never afraid in such a case, said that we must return there with him. When we arrived, the young lieutenant had gone away, and we were able to see the lady at once. We explained the purpose of our visit, but she told us, "Gentlemen, everything in this house has already been taken by the general who lives here." "And where is this gentleman?" I asked. "He has gone out," she said. "Very well. When he returns, you will show him our certificate of requisition." Whereupon we went down into the cellar and immediately began to pack up some bottles of champagne and other wines. As we were making ready to leave, with about 30 bottles, the young officer received us at the door of the cellar with these words, "I'll teach you to drink my champagne. You drink water, you rascals." But Kedor, who was not afraid, shouted in his face, "What are you saying? Who are you? What are you doing in this house?" "I am the general's adjutant, and I order you to leave this wine alone and to quit this place as quickly as possible." "Shut up! Keep your mouth closed. I am older than you. I believe you are only an impostor. You'll hear from me," answered the bold Kedor. Finally, we arrived at Schmidt's quarters with our stolen wine, but we could not drink much of it since our departure was fixed for 4:30. We had hardly time to have a bite before setting out. Barely 6 kilometers from Rocourt, we had to halt in order to let other troops go by, because we were the reserves. This delay gave Schmidt an opportunity to send us back to get some more wine, because we would probably be going through places which had already been stripped of everything by the troops preceding us. So I set out with Lieutenant Abraham of the 8th Company and Löffelhardt. All of us rode bicycles. We were delighted to be able to annoy the young lieutenant again. In the village, Lieutenant Abraham stopped a moment to speak to some soldier acquaintances, so Löffelhardt and I went on ahead and presented ourselves alone at the door of the old lady's villa. We knocked several times, but no one answered. Then we jumped over the garden wall and removed the iron bar in order to open the door and put our bicycles inside. We were very much surprised to hear threatening words in German. The door of the house was also closed, so we climbed in at a window, and were soon in the room from which the noise came. There we saw a strange sight. In the room were non-commissioned officer Kumpfe, who was one of our party the first time we had come for the wine, Janecke, a first-class private, and the old lady. The latter was completely undressed and appeared about to faint. When she saw us, she started to cry, probably thinking that we also had come to hurt her. I told her to dress herself and to tell us what had happened. "About half an hour ago," she said, "these 2 gentlemen broke into my room through the window and asked for money. I told them I had none because my son had gone away and taken it with him. Not understanding French, they thought I was refusing to give it to them. I took them into the dining room to give them something to eat, but they pointed their revolvers at me and dragged me into this room. I tried to make them understand that they would find nothing which would be of the slightest value to them. Then the taller one, this was Kumpfe, sat down on my bed and made me understand by signs that I was to get undressed. In like manner, I tried to convey to him that I am an old woman, 63 years old, and begged him to remember his mother and to spare me such dishonour. Then this gentleman took a candle and set fire to my bed. I beg you to look at the sheets and blankets. Half mad with fear, I tore off my clothes, ready to submit to the inevitable, when luckily you gentlemen came. Then I explained to the lady why we had come back to see her, that she must not be afraid of us, and that we would pay her in requisition certificates, which had the same value as current money. Kumpfe, now thoroughly scared, begged me to say nothing of what we had seen. Both he and Janecke asked the old lady's pardon. She also asked us not to say anything, because she did not want these men to be punished, and because she was embarrassed by the whole business. Loffelhart and I promised her to keep it secret. She asked us all to have something to eat, and you may be sure we did not refuse. Lieutenant Abraham, who had just arrived, also accepted her invitation, and seemed very much pleased with the good woman. We did not tell him all that she had endured. After supper, she herself took us to the cellar to get some wine. Since we could not carry it all with us, we told her to bury the rest, because I had marked on the requisition bill that we had taken everything, but I doubt if she did that. Later on, when Comfey wanted to order Janeka to do something, the latter said in a clear voice, "Rokor." Comfey immediately turned pale and gave his orders to another soldier. In the evening we rejoined the battalion, laden like mules, to Schmidt's great satisfaction. The villages through which we passed were for the most part completely ruined, and in many of them even the churches were no longer standing. Now the Battle of the Marne awaited us, the Marne where the French showed the stuff they were made of, and where General Joffre closed the door on our hopes and illusions. Here I wish to tell of some of the foolish ideas of our soldiers, in order to show to what extent these illusions were spread about. We were to enter Paris immediately. That went without saying, and no one doubted it for a moment. But all the soldiers were convinced that we would be in England very soon as well. "How are we going to get to England?" asked one. "Don't worry," replied another. "Wilhelm has already prepared everything. One fine day Dover will be bombarded from Calais, and we will quietly set off for London, where we can eat our fill of pudding." We had the good fortune to remain in the rear guard for 5 days until September 5th, 1914, when we were led under the deadly French artillery fire to the north of Heiltz-le-Maurupt in order to take part in the great Battle of the Marne. The French artillery aimed so well that on the march toward our position, we lost almost half of our fighting force, in dead or wounded. We finally arrived at Heiltz-le-Maurupt, where we had to stop because the village was under fire. Always on the jump on account of the violent fire of the enemy artillery, we reached our positions between Sermaises-les-Bains and Pagny-sur-Saule on the railroad, where we were sheltered. At this moment our communications with the rear were interrupted because of the close and violent fire of the French artillery, which was becoming more and more deadly. We were in relative shelter, but only if we lay in the water. A torrential rain fell unceasingly, and we had eaten nothing since 4 a.m. We had to await nightfall before we could leave our disagreeable position, where, if we were not shot to death, we would probably be drowned like rats. At 10 p.m., 2 field kitchens approached. Without bothering to see to what regiment they might belong, the men threw themselves upon them and stripped them of everything in the twinkling of an eye. Soon Loffelhart and I were appointed to take the reinforcements which had just arrived from Mayence out to the battalion, and to scatter them among the various companies. Some old Hanau acquaintances of ours were with them. The important thing was that they had tobacco and cigarettes, which we had been deprived of for a long time. We showed the newcomers to their companies. Many had only joined the colours 6 weeks before. They were beside themselves at the idea of taking part in a great battle, and screamed so that we were obliged to shut them up, for the French were hardly 30 or 40 metres away from us. I had hardly spoken when the fusillade began again, very violently, and then it was hard to restrain these valiant warriors who began to run in all directions, especially to the rear. Soon Loffelhart and I had to lie down flat in a pool of water. The company orderlies were starting off with new recruits when the order arrived for an immediate attack on the French who were opposite us. That was a real butchery. For the first time I took part in a hand-to-hand combat. Every conceivable weapon was used, the bayonet, the rifle butt, and even the trench knife. The 2 artilleries thundered on and caused terrible losses on both sides. French nor Germans gave any quarter and no one wished to surrender. Our attack failed, resulting only in enormous losses, neither. In the morning we saw Cador approaching with the 4 company adjutants whom he had gone to look for, back where the field at the idea of taking part in a great battle, and screamed so that we were obliged to shut them up, for the French were hardly 30 or 40 metres away from us. I had hardly spoken when the fusillade began again, very violently, and then it was hard to restrain these valiant warriors who began to run in all directions, especially to the rear. Soon Loffelhart and I had to lie down flat in a pool of water. The company orderlies were starting off with new recruits when the order arrived for an immediate attack on the French who were opposite us. That was a real butchery. For the first time I took part in a hand-to-hand combat. Every conceivable weapon was used, the bayonet, the rifle butt, and even the trench knife. The two artilleries thundered on and caused terrible losses on both sides. French nor Germans gave any quarter, and no one wished to surrender. Our attack failed, resulting only in enormous losses. Neither. In the morning we saw Cador approaching with the 4 company adjutants whom he had gone to look for, back where the field kitchens were. He wished to enroll the new arrivals, but this was impossible because we had no lists, and anyway most of them had been initiated by being killed, wounded, or made prisoners. For a long while, in Germany, the many requests for information made by soldiers' relatives all received this simple answer: missing since the Battle of the Marne. Many of these young soldiers did not even have identification tags. On September 6th, the firing subsided somewhat, but it continued to rain in torrents. I was squatting at the bottom of a hole with Loffelhart quite close to the major. A.M. of a sudden, a French shell fell right into our trench and tore 6 men to pieces. About 5 p.m., Loffelhart and I went to the rear, carrying orders from the major to the paymaster. He was stationed with the baggage near Sagny-sur-Langle, together with all the provisions of the 21st in charge of Rittmeister, a captain of the hussars. Just as we came up, the latter was questioning the mayor of Sagny-sur-Langle, who had been brought before him and accused of communicating with the French, and of warning them of all our movements by means of an underground telephone. This suspicion was all the more well-founded because a German battery, which had only just taken up its position, was immediately wiped out by the French fire. A non-commissioned officer of the 6th Uhlans arrived in the town hall courtyard and ordered the soldiers to arrest all civilians. 3 women, among them the daughter of the mayor, a young girl of 18, were found in a cellar which had been their hiding place, and were treated just like the men, that is to say, with the utmost brutality. We spent the night with the paymaster, and were able to see what an easy and agreeable life these gentlemen of the quartermaster's department were leading. While we were doing without everything in the trenches, a frightful waste was going on here. They did not deny themselves anything. Wagons filled with plundered goods were standing in line. Because it was raining, comfortable tents had been put up. The paymaster invited us to have dinner with him, and treated us just as though we were in a first-class hotel. Many excellent courses and all kinds of wine were served. Since Loffelhart and I had had virtually nothing to eat for 48 hours, our appetites were enormous. Both of us were possessed by the one idea of profiting by this occasion, by eating enough for several days. Everything that we ate at that dinner had been stolen. A few steps from us, some soldiers who were guarding the civilians of Sagny did not hesitate to show their utter lack of respect for the women in a shocking manner. Poor creatures could do nothing, and they began to cry, but that did not prevent those brutes from keeping right on. The officers ought to have put an end to such conduct. Are not 2 officers always detailed to stay with the baggage? Where were they? Probably about to celebrate with stolen wine. They were waging war in their own way. After we were quite refreshed, we responded to the call of duty and rejoined our battalion at about 4 a.m. We had to creep over bodies of dead men and horses and the ruins of wagons, guns, and automobiles which littered the battlefield. It was impossible to walk upright without exposing oneself to the enemy fire, so we had to crawl. I shuddered as I touched the dead, and reflected that perhaps a moment later I too would be one of these innumerable and unknown corpses. About 6:30 we reached the crest of a hill. We offered a fine target to the enemy, and their bullets began to whiz over us. So we hid behind a dead horse. Soon we saw some troops in front of us retreating in our direction. How great was our surprise to find that we were in the midst of the 1st instead of the 2nd Battalion. In answer to our questions, we were told that the 2nd Battalion was now further to the left. We went there, and I asked Major Schmidt why we had abandoned the railroad line. He said, "You have heard that the Germans with von Kluck were 20 kilometers from Paris, but you see the matter fell through and we have to beat a retreat. If this goes on, we shall soon have no more men left, for our losses are terrific." We remained there without orders, waiting to be taken prisoners. Charlotte, Schmidt went on, if fate wishes us to fall into the hands of the French while we are still alive, let us always stay together. Why didn't I learn more French at school? Well, that's understood. We'll keep together. We remained there all day long. The French artillery fired to our rear and prevented us from retreating. They were also firing at us and killing many of our men, so that our position became intolerable. The stretcher-bearers did not know where to turn next for the wounded, were all crying out at the same time, calling them from every direction. Some men began to stick their handkerchiefs on their guns to show that they wished to surrender, but the French did not pay the slightest attention to us, only answering by bullets which very often hit their mark. Everyone was demoralized. In order to calm the men, higher officers told them that we were retreating as a precautionary measure, but no one believed that. The soldiers had no compunction about shouting right at the officers. Yes, yes, you were too hasty with your Paris story. Now the French have given us a beating which we shall never forget. Finally, on September 8th, about 7 p.m., we escaped out of the death clutch of the French. We were ordered to begin the retreat, which was wretchedly accomplished because of contradictory orders and counter-orders. First, they would send us in one direction, and then in another. If we had just halted in a spot where we could get a little rest, another order would immediately come telling us to leave it. This uncertainty among their chiefs exasperated the soldiers, who sometimes even began to insult the officers. Many men, dead beat, refused to go on, but stayed where they were, surrendering to their fate. On September 9th, about 4 a.m., our regiment was ordered to act as rear guard of the division and to send out patrols composed of trustworthy men. Until further orders, the bulk of the rear guard was to occupy the southern part of the Somail forest. It had stopped raining and the sun was shining brightly. Our little staff made themselves as comfortable as possible on the edge of a sand pit. They brought us coffee from the kitchens. We took it with pleasure and were discussing recent deaths when a French shell, bursting quite nearby, recalled to us the fact that the war was not yet over. Lieutenant Kedor, who was dangling his legs over the edge of the pit, all of a sudden rolled down, upsetting our coffee and shouting, "Help! Quick! I'm wounded!" Dr. Wolkowitz and 2 nurses came running, but he got up alone and, feeling himself all over, said, "I thought that a shell had torn me to pieces, but thank God, I see that there is nothing the matter with me and that I am safe and sound." We all laughed at the courage of this hero, who went on, "Major, I had a narrow escape. That shell whizzed by my ears, so that I thought surely the end had come. It's good that those simpletons aimed badly." The major answered him, "Kedor, I haven't laughed so much since we mobilized. And just look, the whole battalion is doubling up with laughter. It remains to be seen whether it's on account of your heroism or your acrobatic stunts." Kedor, who was ill-natured, got angry at these remarks and began to pick a quarrel with the soldiers. But he had hardly opened his mouth when they called out, shaking with laughter, "Help! Quick! I'm wounded!" In order to end this scene, Schmidt sent Kedor to the kitchens to get us some more coffee. Soon we continued our retreat. Von Kluck's artillery galloped madly by, with infantrymen who could no longer keep up, and who did not wish to fall into the hands of the French, hanging onto the gun carriages. In the villages through which we passed, there was no longer any question of maltreating the inhabitants. Some of them asked us if we were looking for the road to Paris. Schmidt, for whom I translated these sarcastic questions, did not get angry and only shrugged his shoulders. At 6 o'clock we arrived at Hans, where we were to encamp with all of the 88th, the 87th, the 6th Uhlans and the 63rd Artillery. The streets were so crowded with guns and wagons that it was impossible to get through. Officers swore and yelled, and soldiers did what they chose. Many of the non-commissioned officers were soundly thrashed by privates. While I was going for orders for the brigade, I saw Lieutenant Anspach of the 3rd Battalion swearing at an Uhlan who had touched him with his lance in passing. The Uhlan answered him in a rage, "Shut up, you great big thief! Now you're getting back your courage because we're far away from the French. Be off with you, you poor coward, otherwise you'll get something more." Anspach paled and went off. I myself had removed the collar of my cape in order to pass unrecognized, for I realized that the troops were not respecting their superiors just then. The night passed quietly for the men, but we were kept busy with orders and counter-orders. We left Hans on September 11th about 3 a.m. in skirmish line and retreated eastward, crossing the trenches between Hans and Somme-Tourbe. About 6 o'clock we were relieved by regiments who had not yet been tried out, and we in our turn relieved the guard which had been beaten at Reims. Such was the part which our battalion played in the Battle of the Marne. We were marching northward in the direction of Vouziers when we were suddenly ordered to change our course. Upon consulting maps, we found that we were being sent to Reims. Our march on that city was a veritable forced march, for we made about 50 kilometers in one day. Colonel Puder shouted to us, "Well, we'll have to pull other people's chestnuts out of the fire again. It seems that the guard has been licked, and no doubt we're being sent to replace it." It was at Bourgogne that we met the first soldiers of the guard. Our men received them with sorry jokes. "Well," they said, "here you are, you brawlers from Berlin. Did the French give you a good licking? You just look at us to see what real soldiers are. You're nothing but full-dress soldiers. You know how to shoot off your mouths, but when the battle comes, you throw away your guns and beat it." The officers said nothing and laughed in their sleeves. Those remarks assured them that we would do our duty and would efface the failure of the guards who had lost the fort of Brimont. We were being sent to recapture it. At first, no one cared to attack because of the accuracy of the French artillery fire. But Brigadier General von der Esch ran all along the line, striking the backs of the soldiers with his sword. Thus it was that the brigade retook the fort of Brimont. Afterwards, von der Esch told the officers that this was the best way to make the soldiers advance, and to recall them to their duty. While we were taking the fort, we were continuously subjected to the terrible fire of the French artillery, which continued to pick off our men. Our paymaster Herbert, who now had to come a little closer with his supply wagons in order to distribute the goods, was horribly afraid, but that did not prevent him from getting the Iron Cross. During the afternoon of September 17th, Major Schläger of the 1st Battalion and our Major Schmidt ordered Loffelhart and myself to go to Reims in search of some champagne to celebrate our victory over the Imperial Guard. We left on bicycles by way of Aumenoncourt-le-Petit, Bourgogne and Fresnes. As we were coming out of Fresnes, shells began to fall around us. We thought that they came from our artillery, whose range might be too short. We were positive that Reims was not yet occupied by the French. On coming out of the woods, a regular rain of shells greeted us. We did not know what to do, and thought that the best thing would be quickly as possible to get into the city, as there we would be safe. As we were passing by a farm where a company of infantry was hiding, the soldiers asked us, "Where are you going?" All of a sudden we found ourselves in the midst of an infernal bombardment. Shells came from all directions and burst all around. Artillery, who were really occupying Reims, fired at us as though they were shooting at targets. Realizing our mistake, and seeing that we had long ago passed the German lines, we went back at a dizzy pace. We surely beat all speed records, for we had the whole French artillery firing at our backs to hurry us away and to give us courage. The road went uphill a bit, but just the same we rode on like world champions in order to get out of this hell. Schmidt, deeply moved, received us with open arms. "My poor fellows," he said, "what an unfortunate order, to risk your lives for a bottle of champagne. You had scarcely left when we were informed that our men no longer held Reims, and that the road was being subjected to a terrific bombardment. Luckily, heaven protected you. Was that you rushing along the road like madmen?" This story shows what German soldiers are sometimes forced to do. Surely Schmidt alone would never have given such an order, but Schläger, a Prussian in the true sense of the word, would have insisted upon immediate obedience. Several soldiers who had eaten their reserve rations were tied to a stake with their hands behind their backs. On this occasion, Private Render of the 5th Company, who had served in the Foreign Legion in Africa for 5 years, said that there he had never seen soldiers subjected to such treatment, and that all the stories told about the Foreign Legion in Germany were entirely false. On September 19th, we were relieved and proceeded to Pignacourt, where we took up our quarters on a large estate. On September 20th, we began our march towards Roye. About 3 o'clock, we passed through Neufchâtel. We met detached groups of soldiers belonging to other regiments, leading numbers of pigs, horses, cows, etc., which they had taken from the inhabitants. They said they were taking them to their regiments. Upon Schmidt's reminding them that pillaging was forbidden, they answered that their superiors had ordered them to requisition these animals, but that they had not had time to rejoin their units, which had retreated too soon. In reality, they were marauders. Neufchâtel had not been shelled, but all the shops had been plundered, and the goods thrown helter-skelter into the middle of the streets. A strong box lay in the garden of a villa, the windows and doors of which were broken. The Diary of a German Soldier. On September 20th, Major Schmidt, Dr. Schaefer, Dr. Volkowitz, Lieutenant Kedor, Loffelhart and I stopped at a farm on the road to Lyon, not far from Neufchâtel, to rest and to quench our thirsts. A very sad-looking woman received us and asked us if we also had come to bring dishonour upon her daughters. Schmidt told me to question this woman, so I asked her to tell us what had happened. Then she took us into a bedroom where she showed us the traces of the great crime which had just been committed in her house. 3 or 4 hours ago at the most, she said, 3 soldiers came here and asked me for wine and money. I told them that I had neither one nor the other, and that I was alone with my 2 daughters. They told me to call my daughters. I tried to make them change their minds, but they would not listen to anything. And so, because I was afraid of their threats, I had to obey. Hardly had they appeared when the soldiers, like wild beasts, threw themselves upon my poor children and pushed them into this room where, despite my cries, they ruined them. One of them put his hand over my mouth and held me back, striking me the while. Here, gentlemen, you see the traces of this wild struggle. I think from his insignia, she said, that one of you gentlemen, she looked at Schaefer, is a doctor. I beg him to give my daughters a careful examination so that he may testify that I speak the truth. Schaefer was left alone with the young girls and came back a few moments later, reporting to Major Schmidt that they had been raped by those blackguards. These 2 poor young ladies, aged respectively 18 and 20 years, no longer dared to look even at their mother and stood ashamed before us. We told the ladies that we would put in a complaint, but that it would probably have no result, for there were so many cads who made war in this fashion on innocent people. Schmidt told me to ask them if there was anything more we could do for them. They begged us to leave them alone. Schmidt complained to Colonel Puder. The latter answered that he could do nothing because it would be impossible to find those blackguards and punish them, just as it was impossible to punish marauders and thieves. In that case, he said, Germany might as well make peace immediately, for I see everyone stealing and everyone has rings on his fingers and jewels in his pockets. We would have to jail almost everyone. Schmidt said to me regarding this affair, Charlotte, we speak badly enough of the Russians in Germany, but I think we are no better than they. Perhaps we are worse. On September 21st, we proceeded slowly along the road from Laon. The soldiers were singing. Lieutenant Kedor, who had a mania for tormenting his men, wished to stop them, but they all began to yell, imitating Kedor's voice, Help! Quick! I'm wounded! Thus recalling to him his stunt in the sandpit and making him furious. In his anger, he went so far as to strike several men with his crop. During one of our halts, he saw some soldiers lying on the ground and struck one of them on the nape of the neck. This man calmly got up, took his gun, loaded it, and aimed at Kedor, who immediately began to run in a zigzag line, calling for his horse. We were at a little distance from this scene and were greatly amused by it. Colonel Puder held his sides with laughter. Schmidt had the soldier brought to him and told him that he had done right, and that he ought to defend himself against every individual who might attack him, whether friend or enemy. Colonel Puder and General von der Esch himself also congratulated the soldier. Kedor had disappeared. But since he was aide-de-camp, he would soon have to come back for orders. Schmidt took advantage of the occasion to say to him, Kedor, you have already given us proof of your heroism by showing us that even in the face of great danger, you keep your wits about you and know how to get out of it. But the soldier, who surely would have killed you if it had not been for our cries and bursts of laughter, is still braver. In any case, you entertained us very well." Kedor was very much downcast for a short time and left the soldiers alone. On the 23rd, we left for Fressancourt, La Fère, Chauny and Bougie, where we halted. Each company had sent ahead a non-commissioned officer to secure quarters for the battalion. The peasants of Bougie, simple and childlike people, surprised at our strange uniforms, which were not French and which they hadn't seen before, asked the quartermasters, "Are you Englishmen?" "Yes, yes," the latter answered in order to get good quarters, and warned us when we arrived not to let on that we were enemies. These good people fought for the privilege of having soldiers live with them, and showed us all sorts of courtesies. Finally, I could not refrain from telling them that we were Germans. They immediately ran away, as though a bomb had fallen in their midst, crying, "The Prussians! The Prussians!" It was very funny. Thanks to my having made inquiries of the mayor, Major Schmidt and his whole staff were quartered in a comfortable farm, where we found food and some excellent wine which I had advised the major to send us. Several other officers of the battalion came to dine with us, and thanks to the wine, many were soon completely drunk, including our good Major Schmidt. About 1 a.m. I had to go to Maucourt for orders, and I learned that we were to leave at 2 o'clock. It was about 1:45 when I left Maucourt. I went to the police post to warn the trumpeter to sound the alarm, and then returned to the major. I found them all drunk and incapable of understanding me. Thanks to Dr. Schaefer, who seemed a little less intoxicated than the others, we finally made Schmidt understand what he had to do. He immediately ordered the officers to assemble their troops at the village gate within 10 minutes. We were supposed to leave at 2 o'clock, but at 2:30 the battalion had not yet been assembled, for while the officers were drinking, the soldiers had been doing the same. Also, a great many lazy fellows failed to answer the roll call. Before arriving at Guiscard, we had to halt in order to let other troops go by. Most of the officers and soldiers threw themselves in the ditches along the road to continue their interrupted slumber and to sleep themselves sober. Only a snapshot was lacking. At 8 o'clock, we passed through Guiscard and Libermont. Thanks to our artillery, it was comparatively easy for us to enter the village of Ercheux, which, like the rest, was the scene of the usual pillage. On our right was the 25th Division under the Grand Duke of Hesse-Darmstadt. The French were in possession of Solent, a very favourable position. The Hessians on our right were better located than we were, and could advance a little. As for us, no sooner did one of our patrols venture out than it was immediately shot down. Volunteers were asked for in vain. No one responded. At 9 o'clock we received the formal order to attack at midnight. Loffelhart, who brought us the order, told us that things were not going well with us in northern France and Belgium, and that the cavalry had been ordered to leave immediately by rail, because the English army was offering an unexpected resistance. So the Battle of Solent took place the night of September 25th, 1914. It was terrible. French and Germans fought with blind fury, and neither side gave any quarter. The heroic defence of the French again caused us terrible losses, and we entered Solent at 5 a.m. only by literally walking over the dead and wounded. The eldest son of Major Schmidt, who had joined the battalion only a short time ago, met his death in this slaughterhouse. The father's grief was heartrending. To those who tried to console him by saying that his son had died for his country, he answered, "What do I care about your country? Why do we need a war?" On entering Solente, I witnessed a horrible scene. A German soldier had gone into a house to make some coffee. Near the stove was an old woman sitting up in bed. On her right, an old man in a chair, about 2 feet to leave immediately by rail, because the English army was offering an unexpected resistance. So the Battle of Solent took place the night of September 25th, 1914. It was terrible. French and Germans fought with blind fury, and neither side gave any quarter. The heroic defence of the French again caused us terrible losses, and we entered Solent at 5 a.m. only by literally walking over the dead and wounded. The eldest son of Major Schmidt, who had joined the battalion only a short time ago, met his death in this slaughterhouse. The father's grief was heartrending. To those who tried to console him by saying that his son had died for his country, he answered, "What do I care about your country? Why do we need a war? On entering Solente, I witnessed a horrible scene. A German soldier had gone into a house to make some coffee. Near the stove was an old woman sitting up in bed. On her right, an old man in a chair. About 2 feet from this group, a young woman was sitting nursing her baby. A shell which had exploded in the room had mortally wounded the old woman in the head. The old man was cut in two. The soldier was lying on the ground, dead, while the young woman was sitting in her chair with her head cut off. But the baby in her arms was entirely unharmed. No one who saw this terrible sight could help crying. During the whole day of the 25th, the fierce struggle continued for the possession of the town of Champieu, which we had to take house by house. Our artillery aimed very well. Near the city hall were lying the bodies of more than 60 Frenchmen and dying horses, who must have been kicking about among the wounded. One dead Frenchman still held a German helmet in his hand. Opposite this scene, the field kitchens were installed, and drunken soldiers were singing cabaret songs at the top of their voices. A phonograph was going, and Private Schreiner of the 6th Company was playing a waltz on his accordion. In one corner, a Munich painter was calmly sketching the scene. In front of every house, the bodies of French and Germans were lying all jumbled in a heap. One young Frenchwoman, who had just come out of a cellar where she had been hiding, started to shout in the middle of the street, "Down with the Huns!" She was immediately bayoneted to death. Many Frenchmen who had suffered only slight bullet wounds were, nevertheless, found dead, their breasts pierced by bayonets or their skulls shattered by musket blows. The order, given by the brigade to give no quarter, had apparently been carried out by killing the wounded. On the 27th, we buried the dead. The identification tags of the German soldiers were carefully collected, but no one bothered about the French, who were thrown pell-mell into the trenches, which were then covered with earth. An affecting ceremony was held when Reserve Lieutenant Beck and Major Schmidt's son were buried. A woman of the village went mad and was sent to a lunatic asylum. Why all this massacre, this slaughter? What do those people who started this war really want? Said Colonel Puder himself, much affected by the death of Schmidt's son, for whom he had cared a good deal. On September 30th, 1914, we began the assault on Roye, the following troops taking part: 80th Fusiliers, 81st, 87th and 88th Infantry Regiments of the 18th Army Corps, 82nd, 83D, 84th and 85th Infantry Regiments of the 21st Army Corps. There were thus 8 infantry regiments, not to speak of the artillery, who had previously destroyed the town, especially the northern part. This bombardment did the French much harm. The orphanage, which had been turned into a hospital, was set on fire, and many of the wounded were burned alive. We left the town in pursuit of the French, but almost immediately we had to seek shelter in a sandpit on the road from Roye to Amiens. As we were coming out of Roye, 6 French soldiers who had not been able to rejoin their comrades surrendered. Major Schlegler of the 3rd Battalion immediately ordered those soldiers who were standing nearby to shoot these unfortunate men. But not one of them would execute this barbaric command, and all tried to get away. Then Schlegler with his revolver killed one of the French soldiers, telling his men, "If you don't obey me, I'll kill you like him." So the remaining 5 prisoners were shot down by the soldiers. Schlegler, however, couldn't boast for long of his cruelty, for hardly had the last prisoner fallen, when he himself was shot from the left. He, in his turn, fell dead. Lieutenant Abraham delivered the funeral oration. Such a death was too fine for this murderer. At almost the same time, Cador was quite seriously wounded, his right forearm being shattered by a bullet. The soldiers did not hesitate to say that the man who had shot at him had unfortunately not aimed quite accurately enough. Everyone was happy about it, and men came up to him, laughing in their sleeves, while asking him hypocritically, "Is the lieutenant suffering much?" "No," answered Cador, making a wry face. Come, buck up and show that you are a Prussian officer," said Schmidt. The latter, showing his right hand, which had just then been slightly scratched by a passing shell, added, "Now I've had enough of this rotten business. I'm going home. Let those who want to fight, fight. I don't." With these words, Schmidt bade us goodbye and went to the field hospital. Right after this, he left for Germany. On the next day we heard that Colonel Puder had feigned illness, and that he also had left for Germany. On our right, the 25th Division had just taken possession of Soyencourt and Fresnales-Roy. The 87th took Parvillers. On October 3rd, Lieutenant Colonel Brentano was made commander of the 88th. Our new battalion chief was Captain Barch, a former orderly of the commander of the 21st Division. On that day we took Quesnoy-en-Santerre, which was in ruins. We found nothing there but some poultry. On October 7th, 1914, we were joined by reinforcements from Mayence. Among them were many soldiers who had already been wounded and had recovered. They did not show any enthusiasm. October 5th, 1914, the new trench warfare commenced for us. Each battalion spent 2 days resting behind the lines, and then 4 days in the trenches. We took up our quarters at Carapuy, near Roye. From October 13th to 26th, we stayed before Quesnoy-en-Santerre. During this time, the troops had the big job of digging and arranging the trenches. On October 27th, the French attacked us simultaneously from 3 sides, and we lost our first-line trenches. When we reported this bit of news to Lieutenant Anspach, regimental adjutant, he said, "You are a band of cowards, and you ought to be ashamed of being Germans." This Anspach, a fellow of Cador's type, was himself the greatest coward in the regiment, and during engagements spent most of his time with the Kitchens. Now he was almost always in a dugout. On October 28th, the Army Corps ordered us to attack in order to regain our first-line trenches. But the French gave us a fine reception. We were completely beaten, leaving 400 prisoners, 2 guns, and 4 machine guns in the hands of the enemy. We also lost all our telephone apparatus, and had to retreat still further to a place about 200 metres north of Damery. We had had nothing to eat for 2 days, and in front of us lay more than 200 German corpses. Finally, on November 2nd, we were relieved and sent to rest up at Soyecourt until November 6th. Now we had to turn the trenches into veritable forts. They had to be very deep, with communicating passageways. Comfortable and safe shelters were dug, both for officers and soldiers. There were doors, beds, chairs, mattresses. In our battalion, we even had a piano. In December, electricity was installed. We were bombarded 3 times a day, but the shells did not do much damage. Every evening at 9 o'clock, the Kitchens served us a hot meal, with tea, rum, and other alcoholic drinks. At 4 in the morning, they brought us hot coffee. Some men thought the life was quite bearable in comparison with our past sufferings.